This is the first time I've told this story in a manner like this. Now, I'm not a native English speaker or writer. I live in Brazil, and my family do not have anything extraordinary about them. My dad's an engineer and my mother is a psychologist. I'm 30 now, but this story occurred when I was maybe 10 or 11, sometime in that gap. It was the period of school break. Here it occurs in the middle of the year. So me, my cousin, who was a little older, maybe 13, and her brother, who was the same age, went to our grandparents' house. They lived in the countryside. They live in a state called Minas Gerais. We went to stay for about 7 days. The first 6 days were perfect. Not too cold, not too hot, the relaxing sound of animals, the fresh smell of coffee every day, that delicious farm food that my grandma did so well, a true paradise for a child. And then the night of the 6th day. I'll never forget that. The sounds, the sensations. For some reason, that day I was having trouble sleeping. My cousins were already fast asleep. I decided to walk to the kitchen to get a cup of water or something to drink. With luck, we would have some Coca-Cola in there. When I made it to the kitchen, I found my 2 uncles, who lived on the farm ground to help my grandparents with all the farm things and all that. They were talking about something. When they saw me, they smiled and continued their conversation. I don't remember what they were talking about, but it was lighthearted. Then one of them closed the door. I saw that there was an enormous quantity of locks on the door, including one that was a wooden bar that was placed horizontally over it. I didn't say anything, I just grabbed my water, then drank it before going back to our room. Later on in the night, I was awakened by the sounds of loud voices. I looked around a little lost, and I saw my cousin holding her sister in his arms. She was crying a lot and said, "You hear that, Matthias?" when she saw that I was awake. I then heard one of my uncles screaming, "It's coming back!" Soon after, I heard the first gunshot I'd ever heard in my life. I think it was a hunting rifle. I'm not a weapons guy, so I don't know the type. I nearly screamed. Then one of my uncles went into the room, a rifle in his hands. He saw us and seemed relieved. He smiled, but before he went back, he told us, "Stay away from the windows." And we did just that. For the next hour, I think, we 3 just got together and waited. I swear I remember the sound of something big circling around the property. It reminded me of when a dog walks, the sound of 4 legs hitting the ground. The sound of heavy breathing came really close to our window. Then there was a bang. My cousin screamed, and my uncle came into the room and led us to the kitchen. He never lost sight of that window, training the gun there. Then there was nothing, just dead silence. We slept in the kitchen, and one of my uncles stayed awake all night with us. In the morning, all seemed like a bad dream. But then I went out because I loved the smell of grass in the morning, and I saw these huge claw marks on the outside of the door. They looked 6 centimeters wide, enormous, and these huge dog-like footprints were around the house too. I asked the uncle that took us out of our room, and he said to me, like it was normal, "Well, this is our life here."
I was in high school when this all happened. This was back in 2016, and I had recently started walking home from school. I didn't live too far. It was only around a 20 to 30 minute walk, depending on how much I wanted to go home that day. The school day had just ended, and this was my 5th or 6th time walking home. I decided that I would go the long route instead of the shorter one that I normally take. Little did I know what I was walking into. After getting out of the parking lot, there was a long road that led to a neighborhood just behind the school. On one side of the road, there was the baseball field, and on the other was a small factory-looking place. Usually I would follow this road down into the neighborhood and cut through there until I reached the main road, where I'd be roughly 15 minutes away from home. So I climbed up the side of the hill between the back road and the factory place and began my walk through. There were multiple buildings on each side of the path I was walking on. I had headphones on because it's what I usually did when I walked home. Only this time, since the only cars that would pose a threat, if any, would come from where I can see them. So instead of having one side in, I had both sides in, blaring loud enough to drown out any noise surrounding me. It was a joyful walk for the most part. I kept swapping between staring at the sky and the trees behind some of the smaller-sized buildings. It was the middle of spring, and I live in Michigan, so I appreciate the small breeze and greenery when it finally rolls around. I had walked past one of the buildings, but it seemed off compared to the rest of them. This one had no windows, and the outside of it was worn down, like someone had been chipping away at it for a while with a chisel. I brushed it off like it was nothing and continued on walking. However, during the time that it took for the song I was currently listening to swap to the next, I heard an extremely loud scream. I took my headphones off and let them rest around my neck. I stood confused for a few seconds, wondering if I was imagining things or if it was part of the song. After those few seconds, another scream filled my ears, only much louder than the one before. Now, if you ever hear something like this when you're walking somewhere, I advise you to stop what you're doing, find out where you're at, and call 911 to report it. I decided to check it out and see if everything was okay. The screams sounded almost staged, but I couldn't be sure without checking it out for myself. I walked up to the building so I could look through the holes in the door. It looked old and had a fair bit of rust around it, so it was an average peephole, but more of a rusted away you need to replace this door kind of hole. I looked inside, and what I saw made my stomach turn, faster than I ever thought it could. Inside was a man. He was wearing all black, and a mask that you probably could buy at a party store, if I had to guess. There was also a woman who was on the floor. She had bruises and blood stains on her shirt. The man was holding a hammer that had blood covering the tip of it. I cannot go into detail of what I saw next, but it was the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. I had the sudden urge to throw up. I backed away from the door and threw up, only nothing came out because I hadn't eaten much that day. A few seconds after that, I heard the sound of the man's shoes practically stomping on the floor inside the building, and they were getting closer. I gathered my composure quickly and started to pull out my phone when the door swung open and the man stepped out. I pretended that I had been recording the entire thing to hopefully scare the guy into letting me live if I told him I wouldn't tell anyone if he would let me go. He proceeded to slam the door shut after a few minutes of us standing there, staring at each other without muttering a single word. My heart was beating so fast that I was beginning to be distracted by it, as well as the fear that this could be my last moment. After he slammed the door and went back inside, I took off running and immediately called 911. They stayed on the line with me until I got far enough away to feel safe telling them my location. A couple cop cars showed up roughly 6 to 7 minutes later, and I pointed them to the building. There were 4 of them. When they came back, nobody else was with them. The man had taken off during the short amount of time he had and must have taken the woman with him. They found some hair and blood on the floor, but other than that, it was as if the two were never there to begin with. The police never found the guy, and I never saw any reports or articles about a missing woman or a woman that was killed. After that day, I never walked home again. I always either rode the bus or had one of my parents pick me up. About half a year after that, I eventually transferred to an alternative high school that was much farther away from those buildings than my old school. I was 16 at the time, and I am currently 20, going on 21 in August, and this incident has been with me ever since. I have always been skeptical about situations around me, but after that, I was never even close to the same again.